It begins, as these stories often do, on an ordinary morning. The kind of morning when you wake up before the alarm and stare at the ceiling for just a little too long. The kind of morning when your hands move on their own, brushing teeth, buttoning shirts, locking doors, but your heart is somewhere else entirely. You tell yourself this is what life is. You tell yourself everyone feels this way, and so you keep moving. But what no one tells you is this: you can only run in place for so long before something inside you, something small and quiet and tender, starts to crack. This is the story of a girl named Emmy and the day her cracks finally showed. A story about the weight of glass towers, the long road back home, and the strange, quiet grace of finding beauty in the life you already have. Chapter 1: The Cracks Beneath the Glass. Tokyo mornings arrive like a slap, sudden, bright, impossible to ignore. Even before her alarm chimed, Emmy lay in the dark, awake. The faint hum of trains reached her through the thin apartment walls. A woman next door clattered her dishes. Somewhere far below, a truck rumbled into the market. 5:30. Time to get up. She swung her legs over the futon, toes curling against the cold wooden floor. Her uniform waited for her. Black skirt, white blouse, blazer on a plastic hanger. Everything as it always was. Her movements were precise but empty. Hair pinned, collar straight, bag packed. She didn't think about it anymore. If she did, she might never leave the room. At 6:30, she was already at the station, swallowed into a river of strangers in navy suits and silent shoes. The train arrived, its doors opening with a soft hiss, and everyone pressed forward like water through a narrow pipe. The air inside was warm and sour with morning breath and cologne. Emmy stood near the door, her face reflected faintly in the dark window. The glass showed her what she expected: neat ponytail, faint smile, tired eyes. It was a face she wore for everyone else. Her office sat high in the Shinjuku skyline, a perfect cube of glass and steel. On the 32nd floor, she took her seat among 100 identical desks, beneath white lights that buzzed faintly above her head. At 8 sharp, she opened her laptop. Emails, deadlines, polite good mornings that didn't require answers. Her fingers moved as though she were underwater, typing, clicking, bowing slightly when someone passed. Her boss appeared around 10, offered her a quiet "good work as always," and disappeared again. A co-worker left her a packaged melon bread on the corner of her desk. She unwrapped it and took a bite, though she couldn't have said what it tasted like. By 4, her head ached faintly, but she didn't stop. That's what everyone did here. You keep moving. But sometime around 6, long after the sun had slipped behind the towers, she stopped. It happened suddenly. Her fingers froze on the keyboard. Her screen blurred before her eyes. And then, crack. It was quiet, internal, but she felt it all the same, like a tiny pane of glass splintering somewhere deep inside her chest. Her hands began to shake. Her breath grew shallow. and she realized, with a strange sort of clarity, she couldn't stay here. Not another minute. So she stood up. She left her bag on the chair. She didn't say a word to anyone. No one even looked up as she walked to the elevator, past the polished walls, through the heavy glass doors. Outside, the city was alive. Neon signs blinking, shopkeepers shouting, crosswalk lights pulsing. People hurried past her, staring at screens, whispering into phones. No one noticed her. She didn't mind. She walked without thinking, past the convenience store, past the ramen shop, past an old man sweeping his stoop. Her feet carried her to the station before she even realized it. She stood on the platform as another train rolled in. The doors opened. People rushed inside. But Emmy stayed where she was. Her chest rose and fell slowly, her hands curled into fists. She let the train leave without her. Then another, and another. For the first time in years, she sat down on the cold bench and let herself breathe. The station smelled faintly of iron and warm bread from the bakery above. A sparrow darted through the rafters, wings beating against the fluorescent light. Somewhere inside her, a thought floated to the surface, soft and terrifying. What if I went home? She almost laughed at herself. Home was not part of the plan. Home was rice paddies and old people who stared too long. Home was small and boring and full of memories she didn't want. But standing there now, under the pale light of the platform, she wondered if she'd been wrong. She pulled her phone from her coat pocket and scrolled down to the number she hadn't dialed in nearly a year. Her thumb hesitated. Then, call. It rang only twice before her mother's voice answered. Emmy, is everything all right? Emmy closed her eyes, swallowing the knot in her throat. She tried to speak, but nothing came. Her mother waited, and then softly, Is it okay if I come home? There was silence, not angry silence, not surprised, just quiet. Then, of course, Emmy, come home. That night she packed her suitcase, neatly, the way she always did. Her blazer and skirt folded carefully into the bottom. Her little ceramic rabbit, cracked ear and all, tucked between sweaters. For the first time in years, she didn't bother setting an alarm. Tomorrow, she would take the first train north, back to the valley she'd sworn she'd never return to, just for a little while, just long enough to remember how to breathe. Chapter 2. A valley she had forgotten. The train to the valley left Tokyo at dawn. Emmy boarded while the sky was still bruised with sleep. A faint purple above the towers, the streets slick from an overnight rain. The platform was nearly empty. Just her, a man with a fishing pole, and a young mother rocking her child in a cloth sling. She chose a window seat and set her small suitcase at her feet. When the train pulled out of the station, she felt the weight of the city drop from her shoulders. But it didn't leave her completely. It stayed, sitting quietly in her chest, like a pebble you can't quite shake from your shoe. For a while, she stared at her reflection in the glass, superimposed over the blur of buildings and telephone wires rushing by outside. She wondered how she would look to her mother and father when she arrived. Would they see through her neat hair and calm face? Would they notice she had cracked inside? The city gave way to suburbs, then farmland, then hills. The train's rhythm softened, each station smaller and quieter than the last. By mid-morning, her phone had lost signal. She didn't bother turning it back on. Instead, she folded her hands in her lap and watched the fields glide by. Soft squares of water and green, dotted with herons and the occasional farmer bent at the waist. Somewhere past a bend in the tracks, a river appeared, sparkling in the morning light. On its banks stood a row of cherry trees, petals already blowing loose into the water. She closed her eyes and let her breath match the sway of the train. For the first time in months, she didn't feel like she was running. When she finally stepped off at her stop, Takamine Valley, it felt like she had walked into another time entirely. The platform was wooden, its edges soft with age, a crack running through the middle of the planks. A faded bench leaned against a wall of peeling paint. The air smelled like pine and damp earth. The station master, an elderly man with a cap too big for his head, looked up from his newspaper just long enough to nod at her. She nodded back, then tightened her grip on her suitcase handle and started down the familiar road. The valley was exactly as she remembered it, and not at all. The gravel road curled between rice paddies like a silver ribbon, each field glinting under the sun. Water pooled between young shoots of green. Here and there, scarecrows watched over the fields, some little more than sticks and rags, others wearing wide straw hats and painted faces that had faded in the sun. Overhead, a pair of kites circled lazily against the sky. In the distance, the hills rose up, wrapped in layers of cedar and mist. Her suitcase wheels rattled against the stones, and she tried to walk slowly. It was strange, how small everything felt now. When she was a child, this road had seemed endless. Now it felt like the kind of place you could cross in one quiet breath. At the edge of the farm, she stopped. The gate was still there, 2 wooden posts and a crooked sign her father had carved years ago, the characters worn but still legible. She ran her fingers over the grooves as though to make sure it was real. Beyond the gate, the farmhouse sat quietly in the sunlight, its roof tiles dark and dappled with moss, its walls patched and weathered but sturdy. Her mother was waiting, not at the door, but just beyond the gate, as though she had been standing there for some time. Her apron was dusted with flour, her hands resting lightly at her sides. She didn't speak at first, just looked at Emmy, the way someone looks at a bird that has finally come to rest after a long flight. Then, a faint smile. "Welcome home," she said. That was all, and it was enough. Her father raised his head from the fields at the sound of the gate creaking. He stood there, straw hat shielding his eyes, then lifted one gloved hand in a quiet wave before bending back to his work. Emmy set her suitcase down just inside the gate and breathed in the air of the valley, sweet with grass and faintly smoky from some distant hearth. She followed her mother inside. The house smelled of cedar and miso and faintly of old paper. It felt smaller than she remembered. The tatami mats were worn smooth, the paper screens yellowed and patched in places. Her childhood room still held the same wooden desk, the same creaky window, the same faded calendar on the wall. When she ran her hand over the desk, her fingers came back dusty. But when she sat on the futon, the floorboard still sighed in the same way beneath her weight. That evening, they ate together in near silence. Her mother had prepared bowls of rice, pickled vegetables, and grilled mackerel. Simple, but perfect. Her father barely looked up from his plate, but when he finished, he set his chopsticks down with care and said only, "You look tired." Then he rose and went back outside, leaving the door open to the cool night air. Emmy sat at the table long after he was gone, staring at the pale light of the moon spilling across the floor. Later, lying on her futon, she listened to the valley at night, frogs croaking in the paddies, the faint rustle of bamboo outside her window. In Tokyo, she fell asleep to the sound of trains and car horns. Here, the silence was thick but not empty. She drifted into sleep slowly, as though sinking into water. For the first time in months, she didn't dream of emails or elevators or fluorescent lights. The next morning, the sound of birds woke her. Sunlight spilled through the paper screens, catching on motes of dust that danced in the air. Her mother was already in the kitchen, the smell of miso soup and toasted seaweed curling through the house. Her father was already gone, his boots by the door, his gloves missing from their hook. She found him in the fields, bent over a row of seedlings, his straw hat moving faintly with the breeze. When he noticed her standing at the edge of the field, he nodded to the soil at his feet and said, "Well, are you going to stand there all day?" She smiled in spite of herself, pulled on an old pair of boots, and stepped into the mud. The work was harder than she remembered. Her hands ached from pulling weeds. Her knees hurt from kneeling. The sun warmed the back of her neck until she felt dizzy. But as the hours passed, her breath fell into rhythm with the work. Bend, pull, plant, straighten, wipe sweat from her brow. By mid-morning, she noticed the warmth of the earth beneath her hands. By noon, she noticed the faint scent of wildflowers at the edge of the field. By the end of the day, she noticed she hadn't thought about her inbox even once. After dinner, she wandered to the edge of the paddies as the sun set. The fields glowed gold, the water in the rows catching the sky's fading light. Her reflection stared back at her from the surface, rippling, imperfect, but hers. She sat on the low stone wall and watched fireflies blink to life at the edges of the grass. For a long time, she just sat. It would be easy to believe she could stay here forever. But even as she breathed in the cool night air, even as her shoulders softened, she knew She didn't belong here anymore. Not completely. This was her home, yes, but not her life. Still, it was good to be reminded. When she finally rose to go back inside, she glanced once more at the fields and murmured, as though to herself, "I remember now." That night, she fell asleep without the weight in her chest. And when she dreamed, it wasn't of glass towers or ringing phones, but of dragonflies gliding low over water and the sound of her own laughter echoing through the hills. Chapter 3. Home Not Hers Anymore. The days began to blur. Morning after morning, Emmy woke to the sound of sparrows chattering on the roof and the faint smell of miso drifting up from the kitchen. Her father was always gone before sunrise, already out in the fields, his boots leaving a trail of mud on the porch. Her mother moved through the house with quiet purpose, hanging laundry, tending to pickles in the cellar, kneading dough for noodles. The rhythm of their lives was so steady, it felt like stepping into a river that had been flowing all along, whether she was there or not. And she let herself float. The valley in April was beautiful in a way she'd almost forgotten how to see. The rice paddies shone like glass in the mornings, reflecting the pale sky and the soft silhouettes of birds overhead. The air was cool and sweet, carrying scents of earth and young grass. Evenings fell gently, shadows lengthening across the hills, until fireflies began to dot the edges of the fields like tiny lanterns. At first, she felt lighter here. Her shoulders loosened, her breath deepened. In Tokyo, even resting had felt like work. Checking her phone under the covers, falling asleep with her laptop still warm beside her. But here, when she closed her eyes, she slept deeply. When she woke, she remembered her dreams. Her father never said much to her, but every morning he left an extra pair of gloves by the door. Sometimes they worked together in silence, their only conversation and the rustle of weeds being pulled, and the soft splash of water in the furrows. Once, as she paused to rub her aching back, he glanced over and muttered, "You've gone soft." She didn't even argue. He was right, but she found to her surprise that the work became easier each day. Her hands grew steadier. Her knees stopped complaining. Her breath began to keep time with the rhythm of the earth. In the afternoons, she wandered the valley. She'd forgotten how small it really was. A single road curling between the hills, flanked by a few dozen houses with red-tiled roofs and bamboo fences. The same corner store still stood at the crossroads, its sign faded, the little bell above the door still jingling when she entered. The same woman who had sold her candy as a child now sat behind the counter, her hair streaked with silver. When she looked up and saw Emmy, her face cracked into a faint smile. "So," she said, "you finally came back." Emmy nodded, but didn't know what to say. Each evening, she would sit on the porch and watch the sun dip behind the hills. The mountains turned deep blue, the fields darkened, the frogs began their low chorus. Sometimes her mother joined her, sitting quietly, sipping tea from a chipped cup. And for a while, Emmy believed she could stay like this forever. But slowly, something shifted. At first, it was just a restlessness in her chest, then an itch behind her ribs that she couldn't quite scratch. On the third morning, she woke before dawn, not to the sparrows or the smell of miso, but to the sharp thought that she didn't belong here anymore. It came to her in little ways. She noticed that the calendar in her childhood room was still pinned to the same month she'd left. The books on her shelf were the same dog-eared novels she'd read as a teenager. Her desk drawers still held folded notes from classmates she barely remembered. The girl who had lived here was still here somehow, pressed into the walls like a faint scent. But Emmy wasn't her anymore. At the corner store, the woman behind the counter called her the Tokyo girl and told her how proud everyone was that she'd made it out. One of the neighbor boys, now a man, married with a child, stopped her in the street and asked if she missed the valley. She didn't know how to answer him. That afternoon, she found her father mending a section of fence along the edge of the property. The air was thick and heavy with the scent of rain. She watched him for a while, then asked quietly, "Do you ever wish you'd left?" He didn't look up. He tied another knot in the rope, pulled it tight, and only said, "No." He glanced at her then, his eyes dark and unreadable. "But I'm not you." That evening, as the first drops of rain began to fall, she walked out to the fields alone. The paddies shimmered under the grey sky, the water dark and rippling with each drop. Her reflection stared back at her, faint and fractured. She crouched by the water and touched the surface with her fingertips, sending circles radiating outward. It was beautiful here, but she couldn't stay, and she realized the valley had never asked her to. After dinner, her mother handed her a folded envelope. "There was a call," she said. It was from her boss. A polite but pointed message asking if she was ready to return. They needed her. She tucked the envelope into her pocket and said nothing. That night, lying on her futon, she stared at the ceiling. The frogs were loud, the rain steady against the roof. Part of her wanted to throw her phone into the river and stay here forever. But another part of her, a quiet but undeniable part, wanted to board the train back. Not because Tokyo was kind, not because it was easy, but because it was her life. And maybe, just maybe, she could live it differently now. The next morning, she rose before the sun. She slipped on her boots, tied her hair back, and walked to the edge of the fields where her father was already working. He looked up, then down at the gloves she was carrying in her hands. "I'm leaving tomorrow," she said. He nodded once. "You'll do fine," he said. Then he turned back to the fence. That evening, her mother quietly packed her a small parcel of food for the train. Rice balls wrapped in seaweed, pickled plums, a thermos of tea. They didn't speak much over dinner, but when her mother kissed the top of her head before bed, she murmured, Don't forget what it feels like here." Emmy promised she wouldn't. That night, she couldn't sleep. She sat by the window, watching the moon rise over the hills. The valley lay quiet, its shadows soft and forgiving. And in her chest, she felt that same quiet settle. It would never be hers completely again, but she could carry a piece of it with her, and that would be enough. When dawn came, she stood at the gate with her suitcase in hand. Her father was already in the fields, his straw hat bobbing between the rows. Her mother stood in the doorway, her apron dusted with flour, and raised a hand in farewell. Emmy bowed her head slightly, then turned toward the road. The gravel crunched softly beneath her shoes, and behind her, the valley exhaled, not pulling her back, not pushing her away, just letting her go. On the platform, she sat on the same wooden bench where she had arrived days ago. The train came into view, its windows glinting in the morning light. As it slowed to a stop, she reached into her pocket and pulled out the envelope. For a moment, she held it in her lap, staring at her name written on the front. Then she tucked it back into her coat. The doors opened. She stepped inside. And as the train carried her south, she watched the valley disappear behind her, a patchwork of fields and trees and quiet water, until it became nothing but a memory. But this time, she didn't feel like she was running. This time, she felt like she was returning. Chapter 4. The Quiet Days Between. The train back to Tokyo arrived just as the sun cleared the hills. Emmy stood on the wooden platform with her suitcase at her feet, her mother's parcel of rice balls tucked under one arm. She bowed once to the station master, then stepped through the open doors into the cool, familiar air of the carriage. This time, she didn't watch her reflection in the window. She watched the valley recede, the patchwork of green fields, the slanting roof of her family's house, the distant blue hills, until they softened into mist and disappeared entirely. By the time the train pulled into the city, the sky had turned white with clouds. The air smelled faintly of metal and asphalt, and the station thrummed with noise. Footsteps, announcements, the low roar of trains entering and leaving. She stepped off the platform and let herself be carried by the current of commuters, their black coats and bowed heads familiar now in a way that didn't hurt as much as she expected. Outside, Shinjuku rose around her like a mountain of glass. She stopped on the sidewalk and tilted her head back, watching the light catch the buildings. For the first time, she thought, it was almost beautiful. Her apartment was just as she had left it. The blinds drawn, the faint scent of detergent lingering. Her futon neatly folded in the corner. Her ceramic rabbit still sitting on the windowsill, its cracked ear catching the afternoon sun. She set her suitcase down and unpacked slowly, smoothing her clothes into drawers and placing her mother's rice balls in the fridge. Then she opened the window and let the city air in. It was sharp and cool and carried the faint scent of noodles from the shop below. And for the first time in months, she didn't feel trapped. The next morning, She dressed for work as she always had. White blouse, black skirt, hair pinned just so. But when she stepped outside, she found herself walking more slowly than usual, her eyes catching on things she would have overlooked before. A tiny sprig of weeds pushing through a crack in the pavement. A boy with a red balloon laughing as his father chased after him. A pair of pigeons pecking at crumbs in the shadows of the station. The train was crowded, but she noticed how the morning light pooled on the floor between their shoes, how a little girl clutched a plastic butterfly in one hand as she leaned against her mother. She smiled without meaning to. Her office was still the same glass doors, the same quiet hum of fluorescent lights, the same immaculate rows of desks. But her chair no longer felt like a cage. Her inbox was full, but she opened each message slowly, answering what she could and letting the rest wait. When her boss stopped by, she nodded politely and turned back to her work without rushing. When her coworker left another melon bread on her desk, she took a real bite this time, soft, sweet, faintly buttery, and found she could actually taste it. At lunch, she slipped outside. For years she had eaten at her desk, telling herself she didn't have time. But now she walked 2 streets over and sat on a bench in a narrow park, her mother's rice balls wrapped neatly in wax paper. Cherry blossoms drifted down around her, collecting on her skirt and her hair. Children shouted somewhere nearby, their voices high and bright. She closed her eyes and let herself be still. That evening, she left the office on time. The city outside was buzzing with neon and noise, but she didn't rush. At the crosswalk, she watched the people stream past her. Tired fathers, women balancing shopping bags, delivery boys weaving through on bicycles. She wondered if anyone else could feel how beautiful it all was. On her way home, she stopped at the corner ramen shop. It was a narrow place she'd passed 100 times without noticing. Inside, it smelled like broth and soy, and steam clouded the windows. She ordered a bowl and sat at the counter, listening to the cook hum softly as he worked. The noodles were hot and salty and perfect. When she finished, she thanked him, and he nodded without looking up. It felt like a small kind of miracle. The days settled into a quiet rhythm. She woke to the sound of trains and sparrows outside her window. She folded her futon. She dressed, combed her hair, slipped into her shoes. But now, there was space between the tasks. Tiny moments of stillness that hadn't been there before. The walk to the station, the warmth of the sun through the train window, the smell of bread from the bakery downstairs, the sight of a paper crane someone had left on the windowsill at work. They were small things, but they anchored her somehow. One evening, as she was leaving the office, a young woman stepped into the elevator beside her. She was dressed just like Emmy. Neat suit, quiet smile, phone clutched in one hand. But her shoulders were tight, and her eyes had that faraway look Emmy knew so well. When the doors opened, the young woman hesitated, as if she couldn't quite make herself step out. Without thinking, Emmy touched her elbow gently and murmured, "It's okay. Go ahead." The young woman blinked, startled. Then she nodded, stepped out into the hallway, and disappeared into the crowd. Emmy stood there for a moment longer, watching the space where she'd been. Then she stepped out too. Later, at home, she sat by the window with a cup of tea and the ceramic rabbit in her hands. Outside, the city glowed, not harsh this time, but warm and alive. She could hear the faint sound of laughter from the street below, the hum of a bicycle bell, the soft buzz of a neon sign. She traced the crack in the rabbit's ear with her thumb. It would never be whole again, but it didn't need to be. That weekend she rode the train to the outskirts of the city, just for the sake of it. She got off at a small station she'd never seen before, where the air smelled faintly of grass, and an old man was selling sweet potatoes from a cart. She bought one and wandered down a quiet street, letting her steps carry her wherever they liked. Somewhere between a shuttered bookstore and a temple gate, she stopped and looked around, and felt, for the first time, completely at home. On Monday, she sat back at her desk and opened her inbox. It was full again. It always would be. But she breathed in, let it out slowly, and began to type, one email at a time. And between the clicking of keys and the murmur of printers, she noticed the faint sound of birds outside the window. The city hadn't changed. It was still loud and busy and relentless. But she had learned to see the quiet between the noise, the softness between the sharp edges, the tiny kindnesses that made the rest bearable. That night, as she lay on her futon, she whispered into the darkness, not to anyone in particular, but perhaps to herself. It's not perfect, but it's enough. And with that, she closed her eyes and let herself sleep. Not as someone who had escaped, but as someone who had returned. Chapter 5. The call back to the city. It didn't take long for the city to test her. For a little while, Emmy managed to hold on to the quiet she'd brought back from the valley. She rose each morning and moved through her days with a kind of fragile grace, noticing the light through the train windows, the taste of her tea, the faces of strangers on the sidewalk. Even in the rush of the morning commute, she found herself breathing more slowly, letting the river of bodies push past her instead of trying to fight it. But Tokyo was a hungry thing. It always had been. And eventually, it came calling again. It began on a Monday morning, when her manager appeared at her desk earlier than usual. He held a thick folder under his arm, the papers inside already starting to slide out of their clip. "This just came in," he said, his voice too bright. It's a big one, but I know you can handle it." He placed the folder squarely on her desk and gave her a thin smile, already turning to leave. "You've got a good head on your shoulders," he added over his shoulder. "You'll manage." The smile didn't quite reach his eyes. When he was gone, Emmy sat staring at the folder. It loomed there like a storm cloud, thick with charts, contracts, deadlines scrawled in hurried handwriting. Her stomach tightened, the weight of it already pressed against her ribs. For a long minute she didn't move. Her hands hovered above the cover as though touching it would make it real. Then she closed her eyes, stood up, and walked toward the window at the far end of the office. Outside, the city gleamed under the mid-morning sun. A patch of cherry blossoms in a courtyard far below caught the light, their petals scattered in the breeze. The glass reflected everything, the roads, the cars, the people, all of it moving at once. She took a slow breath, and when she turned back to her desk, her shoulders had softened just enough for her to pick up the folder and open it. The next 2 weeks were a blur. She stayed late every night, her computer screen glowing long after the office had emptied. She skipped lunch more days than not. Her phone buzzed even after she got home. Polite emails that somehow carried the sharp edge of urgency. Some mornings, she forgot to notice the light on the train. Some nights, she collapsed onto her futon fully dressed, her mind too full to dream. It frightened her, how easy it was to slip back into the rhythm she thought she'd escaped. To let herself be swallowed whole by this city that never stopped asking for more. But this time, something inside her resisted. On a Thursday evening, just as the sun was dipping behind the skyline, she stood at her boss's office door with the folder in her hands. He looked up, surprised to see her. "Yes?" "I can't," she said quietly. He raised his eyebrows. "You can't?" She placed the folder on his desk with care. "I've stayed late every night. I've skipped lunch. I've already given you everything I have. And if you want me to finish this properly, if you actually want it done right, then I can't keep going like this." For a moment he just blinked at her, clearly unprepared for someone to say it out loud. Then, slowly, he leaned back in his chair. "Tomorrow then," he said. "Take tonight. Come back tomorrow." She bowed slightly. "Thank you." That night she left the office while the sky still held its color. The city outside was alive, not the harsh, blinding brightness she'd come to dread, but something softer. Shopkeepers were sweeping their thresholds. The scent of grilled fish and sweet soy sauce drifted from the market stalls. A girl walked ahead of her with a bag of oranges swinging at her side, her laugh ringing through the air. For the first time in days, Emmy smiled. On the way home, she stopped at a tiny ramen shop she'd passed 100 times before without noticing. Inside, it smelled of broth and ginger, and the windows were fogged with steam. The man behind the counter barely looked at her as he ladled noodles into a bowl and set it down in front of her. When she thanked him, he only nodded, his hands already reaching for another pot. The first sip of broth was hot and salty and perfect. For a moment, she simply sat there, letting it warm her from the inside out. When she finished, she left a coin on the counter and stepped back into the night. The next morning, the city seemed different somehow. At the station, she noticed a boy in a yellow raincoat crouched to watch ants crawl across a crack in the platform. A shopkeeper whistled as he unlocked the door to his bakery, his arms full of warm bread. On the train, a young woman leaned her head on her mother's shoulder, her eyes closed in sleep. Everything moved as it always had, but now she could see it. That afternoon, her co-worker leaned over her partition and whispered, "The client's here. They asked for you specifically." Her chest tightened, but she stood, smoothed her skirt, and walked to the conference room. Inside, men in dark suits sat around the table, their papers fanned out before them. Her boss gestured to her. "This is our best," he said. Emmy bowed slightly, took her seat, and began to speak. Her hands trembled at first, but then she caught one of the clients nodding. Another scribbled a note. The air settled, and she remembered to breathe. When the meeting ended, the client stood and shook her hand. Her boss clapped her shoulder. "Well done," he murmured. She returned to her desk, her breath steady, her chest lighter than it had been in days. That weekend she let herself sleep in. When she woke, the sunlight was already spilling across the floor in soft stripes. She padded barefoot to the kitchen, made herself tea, and sat by the window, watching the street below. A woman in a green coat stopped to adjust her daughter's scarf. A man on a bicycle wove between cars, balancing a bag of groceries in one hand. A cat stretched in a patch of sun on a tile roof. It was enough just to sit there and see it all. In the afternoon, she rode the train to the river. The park was busy, children tossing bread to ducks, couples with picnic blankets spread across the grass, an old man dozing under a cherry tree. She wandered along the water until she found an empty bench beneath a willow. From her bag, she pulled out the little notebook she'd brought back from the valley, the one she'd written in on that rainy afternoon when she thought she might never come back. She opened it now, pen in hand, and began to write. Not about deadlines, not about clients or meetings, but about the quiet things. The boy in the yellow raincoat at the station, the vendor who always saved her the smallest sweet potato, the way the cherry blossoms floated down and caught in her hair as she walked home last night, the way her own breath sounded now, steady, unhurried, even here, in the middle of it all. As the sun began to set, she closed the notebook and leaned back, watching the river catch the fading light. The air smelled faintly of water and warm grass. A kite tangled itself in the branches of a tree and flapped helplessly before settling. She thought of the valley, the hills glowing gold, her father's hands on the fence, her mother's quiet smile at the gate. She carried it with her now. She would always carry it. Monday came, and she sat back at her desk, opening her inbox. It was full again. It always would be. But she breathed in, let it out slowly, and began to type, one email at a time. Between the clicking of keys and the murmur of printers, she noticed a sparrow hopping on the windowsill outside. That evening, she stepped into the elevator alongside a young woman who looked familiar somehow. The same neat suit, the same tight shoulders, the same faraway look in her eyes. When the elevator doors opened, the young woman hesitated, her hands clenched at her sides. Without thinking, Emmy reached out and touched her arm lightly. "It's okay," she said. "Go ahead." The young woman blinked at her, startled, then nodded and stepped out into the hallway. Emmy stood there a moment longer, watching her disappear into the crowd. Then she followed. Later, at home, she sat by the window with a cup of tea and the cracked ceramic rabbit in her hands. Outside, the city glowed, not harsh this time, but alive, pulsing like a quiet heartbeat. Somewhere below, laughter rose from the street, mingling with the hum of bicycle bells and neon signs. She traced the crack in the rabbit's ear with her thumb. It would never be perfect again. Neither would she. But maybe perfection had never been the point. That night, as she slipped under her blanket, she whispered into the dark, to herself, to the city, to no one at all. "I can live here, and I will." The city hummed softly outside her window, trains and voices and footsteps weaving through the night. And somewhere deep inside her chest, something settled. Not quiet, not loud, just enough. Chapter 6. A letter to herself. The first rain of May fell quietly over the city. When Emmy woke that morning, the window was fogged, and the air smelled faintly of wet concrete and blooming wisteria from the balcony below. For a moment, she lay still, listening to the soft percussion of raindrops on the glass. No trains yet, no footsteps in the hallway, just the steady rhythm of rain and her own breath. Her chest rose and fell in the quiet. It had been months since she left the valley, but some mornings she could still feel the mud of the fields between her fingers, hear the frogs croaking at the edge of the paddies. She reached over to the low table by her futon and touched the little ceramic rabbit. Its ear still cracked, but it seemed to belong here now, its brokenness almost beautiful in the morning light. She sat up slowly, drew the curtain open, and let the sound of the rain fill the room. That morning at work was busier than usual. Emails arrived faster than she could answer them. Phones rang from across the room. 2 different co-workers leaned over her desk before lunch with questions she could barely hear above the noise. But she moved through it anyway, one task at a time. She didn't skip lunch anymore. At noon, she ducked out of the office and walked 2 streets over to the little park with the stone benches. Today the benches were damp with rain, so she stood beneath the awning of a vending machine and ate there, her umbrella folded at her side. Across the park, 2 children in yellow raincoats stomped through a puddle, splashing water up to their knees, their laughter carrying through the air. She let herself watch them for a long moment before heading back. That evening, she left the office just as the rain was letting up. The streets glistened under the city lights, and the scent of steamed buns from the corner stall curled through the damp air. On her way home, She stopped at the little stationery shop near her building, the one with faded paper lanterns and a bell above the door. Inside, it smelled faintly of ink and cedar. She ran her fingers along the shelves until she found a small notebook. Soft cream cover, stitched binding, no lines on the pages. She bought it without thinking and slipped it into her bag. When she got home, she set the notebook on the table beside her tea. The city outside her window was quiet now, the streets nearly empty, the puddles still reflecting the faint glow of the signs above them. She poured herself a cup of green tea, opened the notebook to the first page, and picked up her pen. For a long time, she didn't write anything. Her hand hovered over the paper. What was there to say? Then, slowly, the words began to come. "Dear me," she wrote. "I'm sorry it's taken so long to say this, but I see you now. I see how hard you've tried every day, even when no one was looking. Even when it felt like the whole world was moving too fast and you were standing still. Even then, you thought you had to keep running. You thought if you worked harder, moved faster, maybe you'd finally feel enough, but you already were." She paused, sipped her tea, and watched a train slip silently across the bridge outside. "I'm sorry for all the mornings you woke up with that heavy stone in your chest. I'm sorry for all the nights you cried quietly on the train so no one would see. I'm sorry for every time you looked in the mirror and didn't recognize the person staring back at you. I'm sorry you thought you had to leave to find yourself. And I'm sorry you thought coming back would fix everything. But maybe there was nothing to fix after all." The pen moved more easily now. The valley was beautiful, wasn't it? The fields at sunset, the fireflies, the smell of rain on the hills, and your parents, still steady, still quiet, still waiting for you. You thought you didn't belong there anymore. And maybe you don't, but that doesn't mean you can't carry it with you. You don't have to choose, you know. You don't have to be just the girl from the valley or just the woman in the glass tower. You can be both. You already are. Her eyes blurred for a moment, but she kept writing. "I can't promise you it'll always feel easy. The city will always be hungry. The inbox will always fill up again. There will always be meetings that stretch too long, trains that feel too full, mornings that feel too heavy. But there will also be quiet things if you look for them." The boy with the balloon, the old man sweeping his stoop, the taste of sweet potato from the street vendor, the smell of cherry blossoms catching in your hair, the sparrows on the windowsill. Those moments don't erase the hard ones, but they're yours, and they're enough. She set the pen down and rested her hands on the open notebook. The room felt still, as though the city outside had paused to listen. The kettle whistled softly on the stove. A faint breeze slipped through the crack in the window, carrying the scent of rain and warm earth. She closed the notebook and slid it to the edge of the table. Then she stood, picked up her umbrella, and stepped outside. The air was cool and wet, the sidewalks shining like glass. She walked slowly, letting the city unfold around her. At the corner, she passed the ramen shop. Steam curled up from the pots inside, and the man behind the counter gave her a faint nod as she walked by. At the park, the benches were still damp, but she stopped anyway, standing beneath the willow tree and watching the river glint under the streetlights. In the distance, a bicycle bell rang, and somewhere nearby a child's voice called out, laughing. She closed her eyes and tilted her face up to the night sky. The rain had stopped, but she could still feel it. Faint drops clinging to the air, soft against her cheeks. She thought of the girl who had boarded the train weeks ago, her hands shaking, her heart heavy, her reflection in the glass looking like a stranger. She thought of the woman who had stood in the valley, her feet in the mud, her breath finally steady for the first time in years. She thought of herself now, standing in the middle of the city, her chest quiet, her eyes open, her feet planted firmly on the ground. Tomorrow would come. The inbox would fill again. The meetings would stretch. The trains would be crowded. But there would also be the boy at the station with his yellow raincoat. The smell of bread from the corner bakery. The light pooling between the buildings just so. The sparrows, the river, the sound of her own breath, quiet but alive. When she finally turned to head home, the city no longer felt like something she had to survive. It felt like hers. Later that night, she sat at the window with her cracked ceramic rabbit in her hands. The city below shimmered, not perfect, not gentle, but full of small, quiet mercies. She set the rabbit back on the sill and whispered, not to the rabbit, not to the city, not even to herself exactly, just into the soft, waiting dark. It's okay. You're okay. This is enough. She slipped into bed, pulling the blanket over her shoulders, and let her body sink into the quiet. For the first time in a long time, she didn't wonder what tomorrow would bring. She didn't worry about the train, the meetings, the glass towers. She simply lay there, listening to the rain slide down the window, the faint hum of the city breathing all around her. And she slept. Not as someone who had escaped, not as someone who had won, but as someone who had learned how to stay. And so Emmy's story quiets here, for now. The city still hums outside her window. The trains still run. The inbox still fills. The glass towers still shine. But somewhere inside her, a softer rhythm beats now. A rhythm that doesn't hurry anymore. A rhythm that doesn't demand to be more or better or perfect. She has learned how to stand still, even as the city rushes around her. To see the small moments that belong to her alone. The boy with his balloon at the station. The sparrows waiting on the sill. The quiet river beneath the willow tree. They're all still here, and so is she. Maybe you know this feeling too. Maybe you felt the weight of mornings that come too soon. The ache of moving too fast, too far, for too long. The quiet longing for some place or someone to tell you it's okay to stop running. If so, let this be that moment. Let the noise fade. Let the glass towers dim. Let the trains come and go without you. There is nothing to fix right now, nothing to chase. You already carry what you need. Close your eyes. Breathe in and out as gently as you can. You are here. You are enough, and you can rest. Good night.